Have you ever heard of Operation High Jump?
What's going on in Antarctica?
Yeah, so the U.S. government's like, something's going on with Antarctica. There's some activity up there. We want to find out what's going on. So they send this cat named Admiral Byrd up to investigate.
Richard E. Byrd was known as the man who first flew over the North Pole. Years later, he prepared to do the same at the other end of the world, across the frozen silence of Antarctica. What followed became one of the most secretive expeditions in modern history. For nearly 8 decades, the official records told a simple story of exploration and science.
This story is said to come from his diaries, not his published account of the trip, but something he held back and then later was suppressed by government authorities that found it frightening.
But behind that version lay accounts that were never printed, reports that quietly vanished, and men who never returned. Now, near the end of his life, Robert Johnson, the last surviving member of the operation, has broken his silence. What he describes is something far stranger than we've ever thought. Robert Johnson's meeting with Admiral Byrd. Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr. was never the kind of man to follow an ordinary path. Born in 1888 into a respected Virginia family, he grew up surrounded by expectations. From the moment he joined the U.S. Navy, people seemed to believe he was destined for something larger than life. His story read less like a military record and more like the chapters of an adventure novel, filled with danger, discovery, and a restless drive to go where no one else dared. Byrd found his calling in aviation. In 1926, he claimed to have flown over the North Pole, a moment that turned him into an instant American hero. There were later debates about whether he truly reached the pole, but at the time, it didn't matter. The country wanted a symbol of courage and modern achievement, and Byrd became that symbol. Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor, the press celebrated him as a national treasure, and his name joined the ranks of American legends. He didn't stop there. Just 3 years later, in 1929, Byrd became the first person to fly over the South Pole. Newspapers across the country splashed his face on front pages. His calm confidence, blue eyes, and quiet manner made him the perfect face for American exploration in the age of machines and flight. New York City celebrated him with 3 separate ticker tape parades, each drawing thousands of people into the streets. In those years, only Charles Lindbergh rivaled him in fame. To the public, Byrd was the fearless explorer who mapped the blank corners of the Earth. But privately, his view was different. Antarctica, to him, still remained a mystery. A few years after his first journey to the South Pole, in 1933, Byrd returned for a second expedition. This time, he decided to push the limits of isolation. For 5 months, he lived alone at a small outpost called the Advanced Base, a remote weather station buried deep in the ice. It was there he nearly lost his life to carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove that lacked proper ventilation. Those first 2 missions were considered great achievements, peaceful, scientific, and uncontroversial. But his third expedition was different. As his expeditions continued, quiet rumors began to circulate. People whispered that Byrd had found things that never appeared in official reports, things that didn't fit the world's understanding of the frozen continent. Byrd himself once said that the poles were not the end of the Earth, but the beginning of something else, a frontier that could change how humanity saw the planet. In 1939, as the world moved toward another war, Byrd began preparing for yet another Antarctic mission. Around that time, a 19-year-old Sea Scout named Robert Johnson reported to a Navy office in Norfolk, Virginia, hoping for an interview. He expected questions about his sailing experience, his ability to navigate, maybe how he handled the cold. But the meeting was nothing like he imagined. Johnson later recalled that Byrd himself conducted the interview. The admiral didn't ask about skills or credentials. Instead, he asked, "Can you keep a secret? Are you absolutely loyal to the United States?" Johnson was surprised, but he answered simply, "Yes." He didn't brag or embellish, and that calm steadiness caught Byrd's attention. In that dimly lit office, Johnson sensed that this wasn't about an ordinary expedition. Something else was being planned, something that required absolute silence. Byrd selected him on the spot. For Johnson, the assignment was a dream come true. He was barely out of his teens and suddenly found himself serving under one of America's most celebrated explorers. But he didn't yet understand what that would cost him. His loyalty would bind him to a secret he would keep for nearly 80 years. Their first expedition together. At first, it all felt like an adventure. Fleets of ships heading toward the white unknown. But it wasn't the first time Byrd would explore the continent. Aircraft gliding over endless ice. Teams of men united by duty and curiosity. But as Johnson later admitted, not everything that happened belonged in the official record. There were strange moments, readings on instruments that didn't make sense, radio signals that flickered out without cause, and sudden changes in flight plans that Byrd never explained. It was as if the ice itself was hiding something. But Byrd trusted Johnson completely. That trust made Johnson not just an assistant, but a witness who saw events that history would never document. To most of the world in the 1940s, Antarctica was still a white blur at the bottom of the globe, vast, empty, and lifeless. But to world powers edging into the Cold War, it was anything but empty. Beneath its miles of frozen crust, scientists suspected enormous deposits of coal, oil, and even uranium, the very materials that could determine who ruled the next century. For military strategists in Washington, Berlin, and Moscow, Antarctica was a new kind of battlefield. Yet for the men stationed there, the continent seemed unwilling to cooperate. Compasses lost direction without warning. Radio signals vanished for hours before returning as if nothing had happened. At night, the southern lights twisted across the sky in patterns so complex that some swore they looked deliberate, as though the heavens themselves were alive. Old sailors muttered that the sky was watching them. Officers brushed off the talk as nerves or exhaustion, but those who spent enough time there noticed something strange. Even Byrd, the man who had once seemed unshakable, began quietly altering flight routes whenever instruments behaved oddly. No one knew what he was avoiding, no one dared to ask, and for the young man who had promised to keep a secret, that silence would become a lifelong burden. However, Robert Johnson often spoke about one particular flight, the one that changed everything he thought he knew about Antarctica. He said it began like any other mission. The engines droned steadily, the air was sharp and dry, and the ice below stretched out in endless white. Then, a faint shimmer moving across the ice caught his eye, almost as if the ground itself was glowing from within. Later, official logs would describe it as a natural light effect, just the atmosphere playing tricks in the cold. But Johnson and the others on board didn't believe that. He recalled how the landscape began to look unnatural. Black rock pierced through the snow in jagged shapes, like the teeth of something ancient buried beneath them. Some ridges stayed bare despite the freezing temperatures, their surfaces oddly smooth, as if they had been scraped clean by something beneath the surface. Johnson said he would never forget the moment he came upon a wide crack in the ice. From it, warm air rose in a place that should have been frozen solid. As he stood near the edge, he felt a low vibration under his boots, like the hum of distant machinery. For men trained to think in practical terms, it was unsettling. Nothing in their manuals could explain what they saw. Still, while those in the field felt unease, officials in Washington saw potential. The hidden goal of Operation High Jump. By August 1946, less than a year after World War II, the United States launched Operation High Jump. Officially, it was described as a large-scale training mission meant to test men and machines in extreme cold, chart new coastlines, and prepare for future polar operations. But to those who went south, it didn't feel like research. It felt like deployment. The mission assembled one of the largest fleets ever sent to Antarctica. 14 ships, including an aircraft carrier, destroyers, and submarines. Over 4,700 men and 33 aircraft were assigned. Tanks and heavy vehicles were loaded aboard, along with radar equipment and weapons that far exceeded what a scientific team would need. The official narrative said they were there to study the environment, but no one brought that much firepower just to study snow. Johnson, now in his 20s, was among them. He remembered the atmosphere on the ships, quiet but tense, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. Orders were brief, and conversations were clipped. There were whispers in the mess halls about German U-boats that might have fled south after the war, and rumors of a hidden Nazi base buried under the ice. Some intelligence reports even mentioned warm water lakes and geothermal zones that could sustain entire facilities. When the fleet reached Antarctica, Johnson began to notice two kinds of activity. The first was what reporters saw: smiling crews beside penguins, scientists measuring wind speed, cameras flashing for the newspapers back home. The second layer ran underneath that surface: flights with no written orders, missions assigned verbally, aircraft returning from runs that were never listed on the day's schedule. Crews from those flights avoided questions. Their faces looked pale, their expressions distant. Johnson later said it felt less like exploration and more like preparation, as if they were moving pieces on a board without knowing the game. Then one day, new orders arrived. A ground team was to investigate a sector marked unstable. Johnson's unit was assigned to support them with logistics and radio contact. What he didn't know was that this mission would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weather that morning was perfect. calm skies, no wind, and sunlight bouncing off the ice. The ground team departed with sleds, supplies, and full communication lines. Their target was a cluster of mountains known for strange ice patterns, shapes that melted in smooth circles as if heat was rising from below. Hours passed with steady updates, then the radios went silent. The official report would later claim a sudden storm had hit, that the men were lost to collapsing crevasses. But Johnson, who was monitoring the weather, said the sky remained clear the entire time. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. Search efforts were brief. Within days, the area was marked off-limits, sealed without explanation. Higher commands sent orders to cease further investigation. The change aboard the fleet was immediate. The lighthearted talk stopped, and people began to look over their shoulders. Whatever had happened out there wasn't an accident. Soon, new restricted zones appeared on their maps. Certain mountains were labeled as no-fly regions. Johnson recalled seeing aircraft depart on unscheduled flights, only to return with shaken crew members who refused to speak. One entire team had vanished, and the records quietly erased their names. For Johnson, it was the first clear sign that Operation High Jump was not what the public had been told. It was the beginning of something hidden, something no one wanted to explain. Admiral Byrd's shocking experience. Soon after this came Admiral Byrd's flight. It was supposed to be a standard routine mapping mission led by one of the most experienced aviators alive. His plane took off without issue. Radio reports came in regularly, headings, altitude, weather conditions, until suddenly they didn't. For exactly 3 hours, Admiral Byrd's radio went silent. No contact, no coordinates, nothing. When he finally returned, his aircraft landed safely, but his demeanor was different. Witnesses said he was pale and withdrawn, avoiding questions about the flight. The official log for that day listed only 2 entries: takeoff and landing. Everything in between was blank. Whatever happened in those 3 hours never made it into the record. At first, the missing hours were brushed off as a technical fault. The Antarctic air was dense, radios froze, and signal loss was common. That was the official explanation. But those who saw Admiral Richard E. Byrd return that day said there was something more unsettling in his silence. As Robert Johnson recalled, Byrd's hands trembled as he removed his gloves. He said nothing to the waiting officers. He didn't log his route or mark his position on the chart. Instead, he went straight to his quarters and shut the door. For hours, the corridor outside remained quiet. No one was allowed in. Years later, a document began to circulate. Some said it was Byrd's private journal. It described a flight over Antarctica where the ice suddenly gave way to a wide green valley with rolling hills and running water. There were rivers, patches of forest, and even animals that shouldn't exist in such a place. Creatures resembling mammoths and giant birds. According to the pages, the admiral saw something else. A vast, luminous city built of glass-like material that refracted light into colors he could hardly describe. Then came the detail that caused the most debate. The journal said there was a disc-shaped aircraft moving beside his plane, matching its speed, silent and effortless in the air. Many dismissed the diary as a forgery. The tone didn't match Byrd's usual technical reports. Yet fragments of it echoed what Johnson remembered from that same day: the admiral's shaken state, the quiet urgency among senior officers, and the new restricted zone that appeared on the maps soon after. Johnson said he had been reassigned to guard duty around an unlisted area on the ice. The location had no coordinates he recognized, and the guards were told not to ask questions. One night, Byrd passed him in the corridor. He stopped briefly and said something Johnson never forgot. "We saw something out there we weren't supposed to." Never forget it. Not long after Byrd's unrecorded flight, Johnson received the strangest orders of his career. They didn't come through normal channels. There was no paper trail, no mention on the daily logs. An officer he didn't recognize delivered them in person. His voice was flat, his expression unreadable. Johnson and a small team, fewer than 24 men, were to prepare for immediate deployment by air. The coordinates they were given made no sense. They pointed to a blank space on the map. The flight took them deep into the continent's interior, far beyond their usual operating zones. At first, everything looked familiar: endless ice, howling wind, no landmarks. But then Johnson noticed a change. A dark ridge rose ahead. It didn't sparkle like snow. It looked dull, metallic, and strangely regular in shape. The air there was warmer, enough for their breath to stop freezing. Then came a low, steady hum beneath their boots. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the pitch never changed. It vibrated softly through the ground. When they reached the ridge, they found a long fissure running across it. The edges were unnaturally clean, like they'd been cut with a blade. Snow had melted in even geometric lines around it. Peering inside, Johnson saw something that didn't look like natural ice or rock. It was smooth and curved, like the inside of a machine or a tunnel. Not rough, not broken, but built. Their orders were clear: survey, but do not enter. That rule lasted barely 10 minutes. One officer, impatient and confident, clipped himself to a safety line and descended into the fissure. The rope moved slowly at first, then stopped. After a few minutes, it went slack. There was no signal, no movement. When they pulled, nothing came. The man was gone. Another officer volunteered to go next. He tied himself to the line and went down. Moments later, the rope jerked violently, twisting in the air. The men dragged him back. He was alive, but barely. His eyes were open wide, his face pale, and his body shaking. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Johnson said the man never spoke again. Not on that mission, not ever. They were ordered to withdraw immediately. There were no samples, photos, or discussion. Within days, Johnson heard that the site had been bombed from the air, supposedly as part of a test. When he felt the vibration underfoot and saw the plume of smoke rise in the distance, he knew whatever was down there had been sealed for good. The abrupt end of Operation High Jump. But it wasn't the end. Later in the expedition, Johnson was sent to guard what the officers called a former weather station. He expected little more than a collapsed hut, but what he found was different. Beneath the snow was a stairway descending into the glacier itself, perfectly carved, smooth, symmetrical, and unmistakably artificial. These weren't the rough steps of explorers, Johnson would later say. They were built. I know concrete when I see it, and that was concrete. The stairway went deep into darkness. The air was still warm there, carrying that same faint vibration from the earlier site. On the second night, another officer arrived with a small camera, planning to document what he could. He descended only a short distance before the team lost sight of him. The next day, he was gone. Evacuated, sent home. No explanation was given. The photographs he took were never seen again. Soon after, the stairway was sealed, fenced off, and eventually buried beneath snow and ice. Johnson and his team were told their duties were complete. He understood the real message. Whatever lay beneath Antarctica, it was not meant to be found. Years later, long after Operation High Jump ended in February 1947, months earlier than planned, Johnson realized that the silence extended far beyond the ice. Many of the official reports never arrived. Flight logs were missing. Reconnaissance photos disappeared in transit. Even the personnel rosters had gaps, with names erased as if those men had never served. Johnson remembered the change in atmosphere on the return voyage. The chatter on board died down. Conversation stopped when certain officers entered the room. He said it felt like everyone had been given the same unspoken order to keep quiet, and so they did. For decades, the story of what happened in those frozen months remained untold. The records stayed locked away, the logs incomplete. The ice kept its secrets, and the silence of those who had seen too much became part of Antarctica's own unbroken white horizon. There was one story Robert Johnson said he could never forget, though. It involved a junior officer who had tried to keep copies of a few classified materials, photographs of unusual geometric shapes etched into the ice, flight logs mentioning missing teams, and lists of restricted coordinates that didn't appear on any official map. Within days, that officer vanished. Johnson recalled how quietly it happened. There was no announcement, no farewell, not even a transfer notice. Military police escorted the man off the ship, and his name was never mentioned again. Even Admiral Byrd, who had once hinted at the unusual things he'd witnessed, seemed to change after that. At a final press conference in South America, Byrd spoke vaguely of a new enemy capable of flying from one pole to the other at unimaginable speeds. The comment drew laughter from some reporters and confusion from others. It was the last time he spoke publicly about anything out of the ordinary. From that day forward, Byrd confined his remarks to safe, technical subjects: weather patterns, supply routes, the establishment of research bases. To Johnson, the shift was clear. It wasn't a failed mission. It was a discovery, one so unsettling that it had to be buried. He believed Operation High Jump had found something the world wasn't meant to see, and what followed was a deliberate effort to erase it. More than 10 years later, another event deepened his suspicion. In 1959, 12 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, signed the Antarctic Treaty. The agreement banned military operations and territorial claims on the continent. Officially, it was a symbol of peace and scientific cooperation, but Johnson saw it differently. He believed the treaty wasn't written to protect the ice or the wildlife, but to keep people away from certain places. "They didn't sign it for the penguins," he once said. "They signed it to make sure nobody else went looking where we'd been." Even when they returned to the United States after the operation then, the mood was subdued. There were no parades or decorations, only private debriefings and subtle warnings. The crew was reminded that all mission details were classified and were not to be discussed outside official reports. Most complied. The few who spoke too openly found themselves reassigned, dismissed, or quietly discredited. Johnson's decision to reveal the truth. Johnson followed orders. He returned to ordinary life, married, raised a family, and took up steady work. To those around him, he was just another veteran who had served in the coldest place on Earth. But beneath that calm surface, the memories remained sharp. The fissure carved clean into the ice, the officer who vanished without a trace, the stairway of solid concrete steps descending into the glacier's heart. Years passed, and one by one his fellow crewmen were gone. Some died quietly, others disappeared from record. Files were sealed, photos vanished, and even Byrd himself passed away in 1957, taking his own secrets with him. By the early 2000s, Johnson realized he was the last one left, the final man alive who had seen the places that no longer appeared on any chart, the last witness to a chapter of history erased from the record. He once said the hardest part wasn't what he'd seen, but what he wasn't allowed to say. Antarctica, he believed, still held its secrets, hidden beneath the ice, sealed by treaties, and guarded by silence. In his final years, Robert Johnson decided it was time to speak. By the time he turned 99, he was no longer a sailor or a piece of the Navy's great machinery. He was simply the last living witness of Operation High Jump, and he knew it. Everyone else who had sailed south with him was gone. The officers, the engineers, the pilots, even Admiral Byrd himself. The silence of nearly 8 decades weighed heavier than the medals in his drawer. So, in his quiet home in Virginia, Johnson agreed to one last conversation. There would be no reporters or bright studio lights, only a single camera, a microphone, and 2 historians who promised that his words would be kept as they were spoken. He began slowly, his voice steady but worn. He said he wasn't there to prove anything, only to leave the truth behind. For hours, he spoke of the things that had stayed with him all his life, the ridge that vibrated under their boots, the fissure that swallowed a man and left another too shaken to speak again. He described the night bombers flew over that same site, leveling it under the pretense of a test and wiping away every trace of what they had found. When asked if he believed what they had found was extraterrestrial, Johnson hesitated. After a long pause, he answered carefully, "I don't know. Maybe it wasn't alien, maybe it was ancient. But it wasn't natural, and it wasn't ours." For 78 years he had carried that secret, and now, at the edge of his life, he was ready to let it go. What exactly did Johnson and the men of Operation High Jump find beneath the Antarctic ice? No one can say for sure, but a few explanations have followed the story for decades. Possible explanations on Operation High Jump's discoveries. Some believe it was a simple case of misinterpretation, that magnetic anomalies, subglacial volcanoes, and temperature inversions could have created strange effects. Antarctica is a place of extremes, and in that chaos, men could easily mistake the bizarre for the impossible. Others have tied it to the final years of World War II. German expeditions had reached Antarctica before the war ended, and rumors of secret bases and submarine missions have circulated ever since. But what really is the truth about that? Historically, the Nazis did go to Antarctica. That part is not speculation. Between December 1938 and April 1939, a German expedition known as the Schwabenland Mission sailed south to explore a region called Queen Maud Land, a territory already claimed by Norway. The expedition was led by experienced naval officers and carried scientists, technicians, and aviators. Their goals, on paper, were to map the area, conduct meteorological and geological studies, and secure whaling rights. Germany at that time depended heavily on whale oil, which was used for margarine, soap, and industrial lubricants. Overhunting in northern waters had pushed European whalers farther south, and Germany wanted its own foothold near the Antarctic coast. The Schwabenland was equipped with 2 Dornier seaplanes that flew over the ice, photographing vast sections of terrain and dropping metal markers bearing the Nazi swastika. It was a symbolic act, staking a claim for the Third Reich at the bottom of the world. During these flights, the crew reported something unusual, a stretch of land that appeared free of snow and ice, an area later known as the Schirmacher Oasis. It was a real geographic feature, warmed by underground geothermal activity. Later, research stations would be built there, but at the time, it added a strange twist to an otherwise routine expedition. Then came World War II, and the Antarctic mission faded into the background. When the war began, Britain, which held claims over nearby islands and parts of the Antarctic, became concerned that Germany might use the southern waters for military advantage. German surface raiders and submarines were already active in the South Atlantic. In 1941, a German ship named Penguin was recorded operating near the Ross Sea, seizing whale oil from Norwegian vessels. To protect their interests, the British launched Operation Tabarin in 1943 in an effort to establish small outposts across the Antarctic region. These bases conducted both surveillance and scientific research, and eventually evolved into what became the British Antarctic Survey. After the war, more rumors began to spread. In 1945, 2 German submarines, U-530 and U-977, surfaced and surrendered in Argentina months after Germany's surrender. Their mysterious journeys fueled speculation that they had first stopped in Antarctica, delivering high-ranking Nazis, secret technology, or even Hitler himself. The story grew when a Hungarian émigré named Ladislas Szabó published a book in 1947 titled "Hitler is Alive," claiming that the Führer had escaped to a hidden Antarctic base. No credible evidence ever supported this idea, and the submarine commanders themselves denied such a mission. In reality, though, the Antarctic connection was unlikely. The southern hemisphere's winter makes travel there nearly impossible. Between May and July, the continent is surrounded by thick pack ice extending hundreds of kilometers from the coast. German submarines of that era were not true submarines, but submersible vessels that needed to surface frequently for air and battery recharging. They could not have navigated such extreme ice conditions, nor could they have sustained their crews in the bitter cold, where temperatures dropped below -25 degrees Celsius with brutal winds. Still, the myth persisted. Over the years, it evolved into new versions, some claiming that Hitler's remains or Nazi treasure were buried in ice caves, others that secret military conflicts took place in Antarctica long after the war, and some even claim that Operation High Jump was actually a covert battle against surviving Nazi forces. According to Johnson, it is possible that High Jump stumbled upon something left behind, a covert structure built to outlast the war. If that were true, erasing it might have been less about secrecy and more about preventing panic. But there is also the possibility that what Operation High Jump found was the remnant of something built long before recorded history. This is the possibility that Johnson himself leaned toward. The concrete staircase, if real, suggested a construction older than any modern nation. In that light, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 could be seen not only as an agreement for peace, but as a way to seal the continent off completely, to lock the door on whatever was buried there. The real challenge lies in what's missing. The photographs that disappeared, the reports blacked out, the names erased from crew lists. What remains are fragments, the testimony of one man with nothing left to gain, and the quiet traces of truth left in Byrd's own unease. Perhaps Johnson was right to hesitate. Maybe what he saw wasn't alien. Maybe it wasn't even extraordinary. Or maybe it was the most extraordinary discovery of all, one that could change how humanity understood its own past. What we do know is that Antarctica still hides much beneath its frozen surface. Its silence has lasted for centuries, and perhaps that is no accident. Robert Johnson died not long after that interview. Today, his words survive only in a grainy video and a few typed pages, his voice aged but calm. Before he died, he offered one final reflection. "What we don't know about Antarctica," he said, "is far greater than what we do." Admiral Byrd's expeditions gave the world maps, weather data, and a reputation for courage. But behind those achievements lies another one of missing men, vanished records, and structures erased from history. Whether or not Johnson's account was true, one question still lingers. Why have so many spent decades making sure no one goes looking again? Drop your thoughts about this in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.